Welcome to datascience.show, the podcast where data science meets executive leadership. We talk with top AI and analytics thought leaders about turning data into real business impact. If you're a C-level leader or data expert shaping the future, you're in the right place.
Picture this. A B2C product team rolls out a personalization feature powered by behavioral data. A week after launch, a regulator asks for an audit. The team discovers inconsistent consent records across 3 services, some retroactive, some incomplete. And within days, the product is rolled back, customers are notified, and the board is in an emergency meeting. The remediation costs are real, the brand impact measurable, and the legal team is left explaining why consent was treated like a footnote. That opening is not a hypothetical. It's a pattern I see too often. Today, I want to offer a different pattern. Consent as code, auditable, automatable, and under executive control.
Here's my core thesis. Consent cannot live as a checkbox in a UI or a clause in legal text alone. Executives must treat consent as an auditable policy artifact that ties product behavior to governance levers. If you want your AI to be defensible and durable, you must make consent a control plane, one you can version, enforce at runtime, and measure at board cadence. That's strategy before technology. That's turning data into business impact.
So, what is consent as code? At its simplest, a standardized consent schema and a small set of policy artifacts that travel with a data subject's permissions. Think minimal, machine-readable fields, subject ID, granted scopes, purpose metadata, timestamp, version, issuing jurisdiction, and a revocation token. Layer on versioned provenance, an immutable record of who saw what consent when, and you have the audit trail. Importantly, legal consent language and the runtime policy must map to the same schema. If they diverge, you introduce ambiguity, and ambiguity is what regulators and courts punish. Executives should demand a handful of core components from product, engineering, legal, and vendors. First, a minimal consent schema I just described, enforced as the canonical source. Second, binding metadata, scope, retention, vendor permissions attached to each consent record. Third, revocation tokens and a revocation workflow that guarantees downstream propagation. Fourth, vendor attestations that confirm they honor your consent model and provide audit access. And fifth, a provenance ledger, versioned, queryable, and tied to your incident playbooks. These are non-negotiable from the governance perspective. Architecturally, you can enforce consent at multiple points, and each choice has trade-offs. Enforce at ingest, the fastest way to stop data from entering systems, but it may add latency at the front door. Enforce at the feature store or data catalog, good for reuse and consistent downstream effects, but you need strong lineage. Enforce at model serving, flexible but risky. You may have already used the data in training. The practical pattern I recommend is hybrid. Policy checks at ingest to block clearly disallowed data, plus asynchronous downstream propagation and reconciliation to ensure material changes, like revocations, update derived datasets, features, and model inputs within agreed SLOs. Design fallbacks. If a revocation hasn't propagated, the system should degrade to a privacy-preserving result, rather than silently misbehave. Now, how do you dollarize consent failure so the board understands urgency? Start by modeling 3 buckets: immediate remediation cost per incident, loss velocity from suspended features and customer churn, and longer-term reputational runway tied to brand metrics. Create simple scenarios. A single misused consent triggers a 48-hour product rollback costing engineering hours, customer support, and potential fines. Multiply by likelihood to get expected annual loss. Key KPIs to drive to the board: consent coverage percentage, what fraction of data subjects have machine-readable consent tied to their data, revocation to effect latency, how long between revocation and downstream enforcement, and downstream compliance rate, percentage of downstream datasets or models that reflect the latest consent state. Those metrics translate privacy into risk-managed levers. You'll need procurement and legal to move in lockstep. My recommended contract snippets. Require vendor attestation to support your consent schema for pilots. Provide audit access to consent logs. Include automated revocation hooks with clear SLAs, and add indemnity for misuse tied to measurable compliance failures. Consider two-track vendor terms, pilot attestation for an initial rollout, and stronger escrow and attestation clauses for production. Negotiate portability clauses so consent metadata remains usable if you switch providers. Practical language matters, not just for compliance, but for negotiations that keep product timelines realistic.
If you're asking where to start, run a 30-90-day pilot. Pick one high-impact product lane with clear consent surfaces. For example, personalized recommendations in a single market. Map every consent surface, UI flows, APIs, vendor integrations, analytics pipelines, and models that consume the data. Implement the consent schema and a runtime hook at ingest. Run a revocation rehearsal. Issue revocations and measure how long it takes for the change to affect the recommendation model and downstream reports. Produce a one-page board brief with pilot KPIs, expected remediation cost if you don't act, and recommended next steps. That brief converts technical work into a governance conversation.
Leadership matters here. Who owns the consent taxonomy? It should be a cross-functional steward: product, legal, privacy, and data engineering with an executive sponsor. Set a monthly steering cadence for taxonomy changes and fund a consent runway, engineering time for enforcement hooks, legal time for regional variants, and a small budget for vendor negotiations. Make consent one of the metrics in your risk dashboard, not a checkbox on a compliance report. That organizational clarity buys you speed and reduces the emergency rollbacks I started this episode with.
Before we close, 3 immediate executive actions you can take after this episode. 1. Commission a consent surface map for one priority product and one jurisdiction within 30 days. 2. Require your next vendor negotiation to include pilot-level attestation and automated revocation hooks. 3. Add consent coverage percent, revocation to affect latency, and downstream compliance rate to your next board pack. Do those 3 things, and you move consent from jargon to a board-read control plane.
If you want the consent as code template and a one-page board brief to get started, subscribe to datascience.show. I'll make those assets available to listeners so you can run the pilot without reinventing the wheel. And remember, building auditable, automatable consent controls is how you convert regulatory risk into governance levers. That's the difference between models and value.
Thanks for listening to datascience.show. If you found value in this episode, subscribe, share it with your network, and join us next time as we explore how data science drives smarter decisions and better business outcomes.